Welcome to the Dadventure Show. You have stumbled upon the Season 2 premiere of our spooky podcast,
where we, the Dadventurers, will blah, blah, blah. But you're used to that now.
Okay.
Season 2.
Yeah.
Here we go. It's going to be good. Welcome back to the Dadventure Show, Season 2, where we are going to be focusing almost completely on storytelling.
Yes, it's good to be back. And as Jerem said, we really just wanted to share in some stories. So we've prepared a few selections this fine autumn evening to share with you in the spirit of Halloween. For our first story of the evening, we'll be sharing an adaptation of a true Halloween classic, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, written in 1820 by Washington Irving.
And for the second selection, for your listening pleasure, I will read for you a classic poem called The Cremation of Sam McGee, written by Robert W. Service, first published in 1907.
And now the Dadventurers present The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In a quiet cove along the eastern shore of the Hudson River lies the town of Tarrytown, named according to local wives because their husbands tarried too long at the tavern on market days. Just 2 miles from Tarrytown, a peaceful valley rests between gentle hills, with a brook murmuring softly through it. The valley, calm and tranquil, feels as though it's trapped in a perpetual dream. Known as Sleepy Hollow, this valley is home to the descendants of old Dutch settlers who seem to embody the valley's dreamy stillness. The air itself feels enchanted, as if it lulls the senses into a state of drowsy contentment. Some say a German doctor or an old Native American shaman cast a spell here long ago, explaining why Sleepy Hollow is rife with tales of strange occurrences, haunted places, and wandering spirits. Shooting stars and mysterious lights are more common here, and whispers on the wind unsettle even the bravest. The most famous of the superstitious tales of the area is that of the legend of the Headless Horseman, a ghostly Hessian soldier who lost his head to a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. Now he rides through the valley at night, especially near the old church, searching for his missing head, always rushing to his grave before dawn. The Headless Horseman has become the heart of Sleepy Hollow's folklore, and this tale is passed down to every household throughout this eerie, magical place. The sleepy nature of Sleepy Hollow affects not only the locals but also any visitors who stay there long enough. Even the most practical visitors find themselves daydreaming and seeing strange things after a while. In these secluded Dutch communities, life seems to stand still. While the rest of the world races forward, places like Sleepy Hollow remain calm and unchanged, like still pools beside a rushing river. Though it's been years since I walked those quiet paths, I'd wager the same trees and even the same families remain. About 30 years ago, in this forgotten corner of the world lived a peculiar man named Ichabod Crane. He had come to teach the local children, though he preferred to call it tarrying. Hailing from Connecticut, Ichabod was tall, lanky, and awkwardly built, with long limbs, large feet, and a small flat head. His bulging eyes and hooked nose gave him the appearance of a scarecrow, especially when he walked along a windy hilltop, his clothes flapping like rags. Ichabod's schoolhouse was a rough one-room log building, with windows patched up with old notebook pages and a door held shut by a twisted branch. It stood at the base of a wooded hill beside a brook, shaded by a towering birch tree. Inside, the drone of students reciting lessons filled the air, broken only by Ichabod's stern commands or the crack of his birch rod. A firm believer in spare the rod, spoil the child, Ichabod's students were never spoiled under his strict watch. Ichabod Crane, though strict in school, wasn't cruel. He spared the weaker children, reserving his harsher discipline for the tougher boys, who he believed would someday thank him for it. After school, Ichabod was friendly and often walking the younger kids home, especially if their families were known for good food. His salary as a teacher was meager, and despite his thin frame, Ichabod had a voracious appetite. To make ends meet, he followed the local tradition of living with the families of his students, moving from house to house, carrying all his belongings in a handkerchief. Since farmers saw schooling as an unnecessary cost, Ichabod made himself useful by helping with farm chores, mending fences, herding cows, and chopping wood. Outside the classroom, his stern demeanor softened, and he became quite likable. He charmed the mothers by doting on their little ones, often rocking a cradle while holding a toddler. Ichabod also taught singing, and took great pride in leading the church choir, believing his voice to be superior even to the preacher's. His distinct nasal tones could be heard echoing for miles on a quiet Sunday morning. Thanks to these side jobs and his charm, Ichabod got by. Though some thought he had an easy life, they overlooked the mental effort required for his work. In rural areas, a schoolmaster was seen as important, particularly among the women. With his education and polished manners, he stood out from the rough farm boys, second only to the preacher. His presence at a tea gathering often led to special dishes being served, and he was especially popular with the young ladies, who admired his smooth charm. On Sundays, Ichabod entertained them by picking grapes or reciting tombstone epitaphs, while the local boys, envious, looked on from a distance. Due to his wandering lifestyle, Ichabod Crane became a carrier of local gossip, bringing news from house to house. The villagers welcomed him, especially the women who saw him as well-read and wise. Ichabod prided himself on his knowledge of New England witchcraft by Cotton Mather, which he believed without question. He was an odd blend of cleverness and gullibility with a deep fascination for the supernatural. Sleepy Hollow, with its eerie legends, only fueled his vivid imagination. After school, he'd often relax by the brook, devouring Mather's tales until dusk made reading impossible. As darkness set in, every sound, the call of a whippoorwill, the hoot of an owl, or rustling leaves would send his mind reeling with thoughts of ghosts and witchcraft. Even fireflies could spook him, and he often sang psalms to calm his nerves as he walked home, his nasal tunes floating eerily through the valley. On winter evenings, Ichabod loved sitting with the old Dutch women by the fire listening to their ghost stories. They shared tales of haunted places and the infamous Headless Horseman, or the Galloping Hessian. In return, Ichabod would tell them of Connecticut witchcraft and strange omens, leaving them both fascinated and fearful. Though he enjoyed these fireside tales, walking home afterward was a different matter. Snowy nights became a gauntlet of terror, where every shadowy bush resembled a ghost, and the crunch of his own footsteps made him dread looking behind. The howl of the wind through the trees always convinced him that the Galloping Hessian was charging through the woods in pursuit. Ichabod Crane's fear of ghosts and goblins were mere tricks of his imagination, vanishing with the morning light. Yet there was one force more powerful than any specter that could unsettle him: a woman. One such woman was Katrina Van Tassel, the only child of a wealthy Dutch farmer. Full of life at 18, she was as plump and rosy as one of her father's peaches. Known not only for her beauty, but for her large inheritance. A flirt by nature, her wardrobe, a mix of old-fashioned and modern styles, showed off her charms with gold jewelry. Ichabod, very easily swayed by women, quickly became enamored with Katrina. His feelings only deepened after visiting her family home. Baltus Van Tassel, Katrina's father, was the epitome of a contented farmer. His land flourished, his animals were fat and healthy, and his barn, big as a church, overflowed with the season's bounty. The farm bustled with life. Pigs, geese, ducks, and turkeys roamed freely, while swallows darted through the air and a proud rooster strutted in front of the barn. Ichabod's mouth watered at the sight. already imagining feasts of roast pigs, pies, and turkeys swimming in gravy. In his mind, every animal on the farm was destined for his plate, and he saw Katrina not just as a beauty, but as the key to all this wealth. His fantasies grew, envisioning himself with Katrina, children in tow, riding off to new lands, wealthy and free. When Ichabod entered the Van Tassel home, he was enchanted. The farmhouse, with its sloping Dutch roof and cozy porch, was brimming with abundance. Inside, pewter dishes gleamed, strings of dried fruits adorned the walls, and in the parlor, polished mahogany furniture and silverware reflected the firelight. Everywhere he looked, Ichabod saw the signs of wealth and comfort, further deepening his desire for Katrina and her inheritance. From the moment Ichabod laid eyes on Katrina and her family's wealth, he was consumed by a singular desire to win her heart. Yet this was no simple quest. Unlike the knights of old who vanquished mythical foes with ease, Ichabod faced the fickle whims of a flirtatious maiden, thwarted at every turn by her changing affections and fierce competition from real-life rivals, strong men who guarded her heart like sentinels. The most formidable of these rivals was Abraham Van Brunt, known as Brom Bones. A broad-shouldered figure famed for his strength and courage, Brom embodied the spirit of the countryside. His curly black hair and confident grin marked him as a local hero, skilled on horseback and a force to be reckoned with at every race and brawl. With a mischievous charm, he ruled over local contests and disputes, his very presence sending ripples of excitement through the village. For some time, Brom had courted Katrina with rough affection, his advances as clumsy as a bear's embrace. Rumor had it that she didn't entirely discourage him, and whenever Brom appeared, other suitors quickly retreated. His horse, tied outside the Van Tassel home, was a sure sign that he was inside, leading rival suitors to seek companionship elsewhere. Faced with such a daunting opponent, many would have surrendered. Yet, Ichabod possessed a resilience akin to a bending branch. Under pressure, he might sway, but would not break. Confronting Brom directly would be folly, so Ichabod opted for subtlety. As the local singing instructor, he frequented the Van Tassel household undeterred by the amiable Balt Van Tassel, who trusted his daughter's judgment, and an oblivious Mrs. Van Tassel, busy tending to her household. While Mrs. Van Tassel spun yarn on one end of the porch, Balt sat contentedly smoking his pipe, blissfully unaware of the courtship unfolding at the other. This allowed Ichabod to steal moments with Katrina beneath the grand elm tree by the spring, or stroll with her at twilight when a lover's words carried a magic all their own. The mysteries of a woman's heart elude me. Some possess a single tender spot, while others offer countless paths to affection, each a victory in its own right. Capturing the heart of a flirt, however, demands not only conquest, but constant vigilance. It was evident that Ichabod's efforts began to weaken Brom Bones' hold over Katrina. Brom's horse was absent from her home on Sunday nights, tension brewing between him and the schoolmaster. Brom, with his rough sense of honor, would have preferred to settle matters in a duel like the knights of old, but Ichabod was wise enough to avoid such folly. He had overheard Brom boast he could fold him in half and was determined to evade that fate. Frustrated by Ichabod's refusal to fight, Brom turned to practical jokes, invading Ichabod's once peaceful existence. From clogging the schoolhouse chimney to turning his classroom upside down, Ichabod suspected witches were at work. Yet it was Brom's mockery before Katrina that stung most, even training his dog to compete with Ichabod in song. Days passed without much change in the contest for Katrina's heart. One sunlit autumn afternoon, Ichabod perched on his high stool, ruling over his classroom with a ruler in hand, while the dreaded birch rod hung ominously on the wall. His desk was cluttered with the forbidden treasures of distracted students. Half-eaten apples, pop guns, and little paper roosters. Just as silence enveloped the room, a messenger, a man on a wild colt, arrived with an invitation to a quilting frolic at the Van Tassel home. The class erupted into a frenzy, students abandoning their studies, tossing books and ink about in gleeful chaos as they dashed out into the green, exhilarated by their early freedom. Determined to impress at the party, Ichabod took special care in preparing himself. He brushed his threadbare black suit and used a shard of mirror to tidy his hair. Eager to arrive in style, he borrowed a horse from the grumpy old farmer Hans Van Ripper. Ichabod set off like a knight on a quest, riding Gunpowder, a scrawny, aged plow horse. With a crooked neck and a hammer-shaped head, Gunpowder bore the marks of time. A tangled mane, one milky eye, and a spirit that, despite its age, still held more fire than any young steed around. Ichabod presented a comical side atop his horse, his knees nearly brushing the saddle as he rode with stirrups too short. His pointy elbows jutted out like a grasshopper's, and he held his whip aloft like a scepter, flapping his arms as the horse trotted along. His small wool hat sat low on his forehead, and the tails of his long black coat trailed behind him, almost touching the horse's tail. Such an awkward duo, Ichabod and his steed, was rarely seen in daylight. The day was a beautiful autumn spectacle. The sky was serene, and the landscape was adorned in rich golden hues of harvest. Trees were transforming into shades of brown and yellow, with some sporting brighter frosted colors of orange and purple. Wild ducks soared overhead, and the chatter of squirrels filled the air, occasionally punctuated by the soft whistle of quail from the fields. Small birds flitted about, enjoying their last meals before winter, chirping cheerfully. The bold robin called out while flocks of blackbirds flew overhead. Ichabod reveled in the sights of the fall harvest around him. Apple-laden trees, fields of corn with golden ears, and sunbathing pumpkins promising days of pie. The sweet scent of blooming buckwheat wafted through the air, evoking memories of pancakes slathered in butter and syrup prepared by none other than Katrina Van Tassel. Lost in those delightful thoughts, Ichabod rode along a ridge, taking in the stunning views of the mighty Hudson River. The sun dipped slowly in the west, casting a soft golden light that faded into deep blues. Upon arriving at the Van Tassel mansion, Ichabod found the yard bustling with locals. Old farmers in homespun attire mingled with their lively wives, while their daughters donned youthful, albeit old-fashioned garments. The young men wore square-cut coats with large brass buttons, their hair tied back with ribbons. Yet it was Brom Bones who commanded attention, arriving on his wild horse Daredevil. This spirited beast matched its rider's energy, for Brom thrived on riding the most unpredictable horses, finding the tame ones far too dull for his adventurous spirit. Oh, how I long to pause and fully describe the sumptuous feast that greeted my hero upon his entry into the grand parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. It was not merely the rosy-cheeked young women that captivated him, but the magnificent spread of a proper Dutch harvest banquet. The table overflowed with cakes that only seasoned Dutch housewives could recognize: sturdy donuts, soft olykoek, and crispy crullers, alongside sweet cakes, ginger cakes, and honey cakes, a veritable cake extravaganza. The feast also boasted apple, peach, and pumpkin pies, slices of ham and smoked beef, and delicacies of preserved fruits. Roasted chicken and broiled fish completed this delightful hodgepodge, with a steaming teapot at the center, wafting warmth through the room. Ichabod, thankfully unhurried, relished every morsel. As his stomach filled, Ichabod's spirits lifted. The more he ate, the cheerier he became, much like a man who drinks deeply. With each bite, he imagined a future where such wealth and luxury were his own. Old Baltus Van Tassel, round and glowing like the harvest moon, mingled with guests, his hospitality warm and genuine, a firm handshake here, a hearty laugh there, urging everyone to dig in. The lively strains of music soon drew everyone to the dance floor. An old gray-haired man, the neighborhood's one-man band for over 50 years, played on a worn fiddle, stomping his foot in time with the dancing couples. Ichabod, equally proud of his dancing as his singing, moved about the floor like a man possessed. Farmhands and servants clustered at the doors and windows, their gleeful faces reflecting the joy of the moment. Katrina, the object of his affections, danced with him, clearly entertained by his antics, while Brom Bones brooded in a corner, consumed by jealousy. When the dancing concluded, Ichabod joined a group of older men, including Van Tassel, who were perched at the porch's far end, puffing on their pipes and reminiscing about the past, especially the Revolutionary War. This area was a treasure trove of tales and heroes. During the war, British and American lines ran close, making the town a hotspot for daring deeds. Each storyteller embellished their role in the events, ensuring they were the stars of their own legends. There was the tale of Duffu Martling, a blue-bearded Dutchman who nearly felled a British warship with an old cannon until it exploded after 6 shots. Another man regaled the group with a story of deflecting a musket ball with his sword during the Battle of White Plains, always ready to showcase his slightly bent sword as proof. Yet these tales paled in comparison to the ghost stories that thrived in the area, passed down through generations. In these settled towns, spirits lingered, weaving a rich tapestry of haunting legends that had stood the test of time. In the more transient villages, ghosts were quickly forgotten, but here, the phantoms remained, giving rise to tales that lingered in the minds of the living. The enchantment of supernatural tales in this region surely stem from the proximity of Sleepy Hollow. The very air that wafts from that haunted glen seems to weave a fabric of dreams and wild fantasies, infecting all who dwell nearby. At Van Tassel's gathering, many locals from Sleepy Hollow shared their eerie narratives, recounting grim stories of ghostly processions and mournful cries near the great tree where Major Andre met his fate. Whispers of a spectral woman in white that haunted Raven Rock and could be heard screaming on stormy nights mingled with the ever-popular legend of the Headless Horseman, who was recently spotted galloping through the countryside, tethering his horse in the churchyard nightly. The isolated old church, surrounded by locust trees and tall elms, stood as a sanctuary for restless spirits, its whitewashed walls a beacon of purity amidst the shadows. A gentle slope led down to a shimmering pond, with trees offering glimpses of the distant blue hills of the Hudson. The peaceful graveyard, bathed in sunbeams, seemed a place of eternal rest. Nearby, a wooded ravine cradled a rushing brook, and an ancient wooden bridge cast eerie shadows by day, becoming a haunt for the Headless Horseman. Tales abounded, the most notable being that of Old Brower, a firm skeptic of all ghostly apparitions who, upon returning from Sleepy Hollow, encountered the dreaded Horseman. According to the story, Brower was compelled to ride with the Phantom, the two galloping wildly through the woods until they reached the ominous bridge. There, in a burst of supernatural terror, the Horseman transformed into a skeleton, flung Brower into the brook, and vanished with a crack of thunder. This spine-chilling account was followed by a far more boastful tale from Brom Bones, who ridiculed the Headless Horseman as nothing more than a ridiculous jockey. Brom claimed that one night he had been pursued by the Horseman. In his usual brash manner, Brom challenged the Phantom to a race for a bowl of punch. As the story goes, Brom's trusty steed Daredevil easily outpaced the ghostly rider, but just as they neared the church bridge, the Hessian vanished in a flash of fire, leaving Brom to claim victory over the specter. These stories, shared in hushed, drowsy tones, flickered to life under the glow of pipes, igniting Ichabod's enthusiasm as he recounted his own ghostly experiences, quoting Cotton Mather and sharing strange tales from Connecticut and Sleepy Hollow. As the night waned, the gathering slowly dispersed. Old farmers loaded their families into rattling wagons, the sounds fading into the hills, while young couples rode off, laughter mingling with the echo of hooves until silence enveloped the scene. Ichabod lingered, yearning for a moment with Katrina, convinced success was within reach. Yet, something amiss left him downcast and defeated. Did she toy with his affections, merely leading him on to taunt Brom? Alas, Ichabod departed with the demeanor of a thief rather than a suitor, heading straight for the stable. There he roused his horse with impatient kicks, interrupting its dreams of lush fields. It was the witching hour, when Ichabod, heavy-hearted and disappointed, set off toward home, traveling along the same hills he had happily crossed earlier that day. The hour was as gloomy as his mood. Far below him, in the stillness of midnight, he could faintly hear the distant barking of a dog from the opposite side of the Hudson. Though it was so far off, it only served to remind him of how isolated he was. Occasionally, he would hear the distant crowing of a rooster, disturbed in its sleep, but it was so faint that it felt like a dream. The only sounds close by were the occasional chirp of a cricket or the low croak of a bullfrog from a nearby marsh, both of them adding to the eerie quiet of the night. As Ichabod rode on, the ghost stories he had heard earlier started flooding his mind. The night was growing darker by the minute, with the stars seeming to sink deeper into the sky, sometimes hidden by clouds that drifted by. He had never felt so lonely and uneasy. He was now approaching the very spot where many of the ghostly tales had taken place. In the middle of the road stood a massive tulip tree, towering over the surrounding woods like a giant. Its gnarled limbs twisted down toward the ground and rose back up again, making it a distinctive landmark. The tree was connected to the tragic story of Major Andre, who had been captured nearby, and it was known by everyone as Major Andre's tree. The local people viewed it with a mix of respect and fear, partly out of sympathy for Andre's fate, and partly because of the spooky legends associated with the tree. As Ichabod neared the ominous tree, he started to whistle. He thought he heard an echo in response, but it was just a gust of wind rustling through the dry branches. Getting a little closer, he thought he spotted something white hanging from the tree, so he paused and stopped whistling. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was just a scar left by lightning, the white wood exposed beneath the bark. Suddenly, he heard a groan that sent his teeth chattering and his knees shaking against the saddle. It was merely the sound of one massive branch rubbing against another in the breeze. He managed to pass the tree safely, but new dangers lay ahead. About 200 yards down the road, a small brook crossed his path, flowing into a marshy, heavily wooded glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs lay side by side, serving as a bridge over the stream. On the side of the road where the brook entered the woods, a cluster of oaks and chestnuts tangled with wild grapevines cast a dark shadow. Crossing this bridge was the ultimate test of courage. This very spot was where the unfortunate Major Andre had been captured, and it was under the cover of those chestnuts and vines that the brave locals had ambushed him. Since then, the stream had been considered haunted, and any schoolboy forced to pass it alone after dark felt a chill run down his spine. As Ichabod approached the brook, his heart began to race. Gathering his courage, he gave his horse a series of sharp kicks in the ribs and attempted to dash across the bridge. But instead of moving forward, the stubborn old horse turned sideways and crashed against the fence. Ichabod's anxiety grew with the delay, so he yanked the reins and kicked again. The horse finally started moving, but only to plunge into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes on the other side of the road. Ichabod whipped and kicked at Gunpowder's bony sides, and the horse took off, snorting and panting, but skidded to a stop right by the bridge, nearly sending Ichabod flying over its head. At that moment, he heard a splashing noise beside the bridge, catching his attention. In the dark shadows of the grove near the brook, he saw something massive, oddly shaped and looming. It didn't move, but seemed to gather in the darkness like a giant monster ready to pounce. Ichabod's hair stood on end with terror. What was he to do? It was too late to turn back, and besides, what chance did he have against a ghost or a goblin, if that's what it was, that could ride the wind? Summoning a show of courage, he called out in a shaky voice, "Who are you?" There was no answer. He repeated his question, this time more frantically. "Who are you?" Still nothing. He spurred Gunpowder again, shut his eyes, and involuntarily burst into a hymn. Just then, the shadowy figure stirred and leapt into the middle of the road. Despite the dark night, Ichabod could make out the outline of the figure. He seemed to be a large man on a black horse, but he offered no threat or friendliness, merely trotting alongside Ichabod, keeping pace with Gunpowder, who had regained his composure. Ichabod, feeling uneasy with this strange companion, remembered Brombone's tale of the galloping Hessian and urged his horse to move faster, hoping to leave the figure behind. But the stranger matched his pace. Ichabod slowed down, thinking to drop back, and the other did the same. Panic sank into him as he tried to sing again, but his dry mouth wouldn't let him. There was something haunting and unsettling about the persistent silence of this mysterious figure. Then, climbing a slight rise that brought the stranger into view against the night sky, Ichabod's heart dropped. The rider was headless. His horror increased when he noticed the head that should have been on the rider's shoulders was resting on the pommel of his saddle. Ichabod's fear turned to desperation as he kicked and whipped Gunpowder, hoping for a sudden escape, but the ghostly rider kept right alongside him. They sped through the woods, stones flying and sparks shooting up with every stride. Ichabod's flimsy clothes flapped in the wind as he leaned far over his horse's head, desperate to flee. They reached the road leading to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, seeming possessed, veered left downhill instead of following the path. This road wound through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, crossing the famous bridge from local ghost stories. And beyond that rose the green hill where the whitewashed church stood. For a moment, Ichabod had an advantage, thanks to the panicked horse. But just as he made it halfway through the hollow, the saddle's girths suddenly gave way, and he felt it slipping off. He grabbed the pommel in a last-ditch effort to hold on, but it was useless. Just in time, he managed to cling to Gunpowder's neck as the saddle fell to the ground, thumping loudly beneath him. For a moment, he was struck by the thought of Hans Van Ripper's anger. After all, it was his Sunday saddle, but there was no time for such worries. The horseman was hot on his tail, and Ichabod struggled to stay on the horse, slipping from one side to the other, jolting violently as he tried to maintain his balance. Suddenly, an opening in the trees appeared, and he hoped the church bridge was close. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the brook confirmed he was right. He could dimly see the church walls glowing under the trees ahead. He remembered the spot where Brombone's ghostly rival had vanished.
If I can just reach that bridge,
Ichabod thought,
I'll be safe.
Just then, he heard the black steed panting and breathing heavily right behind him. He could almost feel its hot breath. With another desperate kick in the ribs, Gunpowder launched himself onto the bridge, thundering over the planks. He made it to the other side, and Ichabod glanced back, expecting his pursuer to disappear in a flash of fire and brimstone. Instead, he saw the horseman rising in his stirrups, ready to hurl his head at him. Ichabod tried to dodge the horrific missile, but it was too late. It collided with his skull with a massive crash, sending him tumbling into the dirt, while Gunpowder, the black horse, and the ghostly rider sped by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without its saddle and with the bridle lying on the ground, quietly grazing at his owner's gate. Ichabod didn't show up for breakfast, and when dinner time rolled around, he was still missing. The local boys gathered at the schoolhouse and wandered around the banks of the brook, but there was no sign of their teacher. Hans Van Ripper began to feel uneasy about Ichabod's fate and his missing saddle. A search was initiated, and after some thorough investigation, they found clues. Along the road leading to the church, they discovered the saddle trampled into the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves were deeply imprinted in the ground, clearly made in a hurry, leading to the bridge. On the bank of the wide section of the brook, where the water ran deep and dark, they found Ichabod's hat, along with a smashed pumpkin. Despite their search, Ichabod's body remained elusive. Hans Van Ripper examined his belongings, which consisted of 2.5 shirts, 2 neck stocks, a few pairs of woolen stockings, an old pair of corduroy pants, a rusty razor, a dog-eared book of psalms, and a broken pitch pipe. The books and furniture in the schoolhouse all belonged to the community, with the exception of Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book on dreams, the latter filled with Ichabod's scribbled verses in honor of the heiress Van Tassel. Disillusioned, Hans tossed these magical tomes and poetic drafts into the fire, deciding henceforth to keep his children from school, believing reading and writing bore no good fruit, Any money Ichabod possessed had likely vanished with him, as he had just received his quarter's pay a few days prior. The mysterious event spurred much speculation at church that Sunday. Groups gathered at the churchyard, the bridge, and the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found, recalling the tales of Brower, Bones, and others. After careful consideration, they shook their heads, concluding that Ichabod had been claimed by the Galloping Hessian. As a bachelor with no debts, his absence caused little concern. The school relocated, and a new teacher took his place. Years later, an old farmer returning from New York reported that Ichabod was alive, having left due to fear of the horsemen and embarrassment over the heiress. He had moved far away, balancing teaching with law studies, eventually becoming a politician and a justice of the 10-pound court. Shortly after Ichabod's disappearance, Brom Bones married the lovely Katrina and was often seen smirking at the mention of Ichabod's tale, bursting into laughter over the pumpkin, leading many to suspect he knew more than he revealed. Yet the old country wives, true judges of such matters, insist that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural forces. His tale is still recounted around winter fires, and the bridge has become steeped in superstition, prompting rerouting of the road to approach the church by the mill pond. The abandoned schoolhouse fell into disrepair, said to be haunted by the unfortunate teacher's spirit. A plowboy returning home on a quiet summer evening sometimes hears Ichabod's voice in the distance, singing a sorrowful psalm amid the stillness of Sleepy Hollow.
There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. And the Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home in the South to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold, through the parka's fold it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd close, then the lashes froze till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed and the stars o'erhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in this trip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request." Well, he seemed so low, I couldn't say no. Then he says with a sort of a moan, "It's this cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clean through to the bone. Yet 'tain't being dead, it's my awful dread of the icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that, foul or fair, you'll cremate my last remains." Well, a pal's last need is a thing to heed, so I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the streak of dawn, but gosh, he looked ghastly pale. He crouched on the sleigh and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in that land of death, and I hurried horror-driven, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, "You may tax your brawn and brains, but you promised true, and it's up to you to cremate those last remains." Now, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. In the days to come, though my lips were dumb, in my heart how I cursed that load. In the long, long night, by the lone firelight, while the huskies, round in a ring, howled out their woes to the homeless snows, oh, gosh, how I loathed the thing. And every day, that quiet clay seemed to heavy and heavier grow. And on I went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sing to the hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin. Till I came to the marge of Lake Labarge, and a derelict there lay. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice it was called the Alice May. And I looked at it, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum. Then here, said I with a sudden cry, is my crematorium. Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying round, and I heaped the fuel higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared. Such a blaze you seldom see. And I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I didn't like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens scowled, and the huskies howled, and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks, and I don't know why. And the greasy smoke in an inky cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out, and they danced about ere again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, I'll just take a peep inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked. Then the door I opened wide, and there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile you could see a mile, and he said, Please close that door. It's fine in here, but I greatly fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold, and the Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee.
We hope you have enjoyed our spooky tales for tonight's episode.
And our terrible fake Russian accent. That's not what I do. It was so good. Great job. And we'd like to thank all of you for listening and request humbly that you also like and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. We're going to be shooting for a bi-weekly release schedule. We're going to let you try to interpret that because bi-weekly can be 2 times a week or it could be once every 2 weeks. So I guess you'll just have to wait and see what it means.
So yeah, just every 2 weeks. And if you're interested in supporting the show, please do check us out on patreon.com as well. Also, we would love it if you would visit our website, dadventureshow.com, to submit your own stories, your own works of fiction.
Yeah, for all of you aspiring authors out there. Or if you know of a story that you just really love, if it's a short story in the fantasy, sci-fi, even horror genre, but as long as it's a kind of a clean-esque story. Family-friendly story. We would love to get submissions from you guys, things that you know you love, and we will just do our best to make them awesome for you, because we love you.
And with that, we would like to wish you a very happy and safe Halloween.
This audio program is copyright 2024 by Dadventure Media Group. All rights reserved. No duplication or reproduction of this audio program is permitted without the written consent of Dadventure Media Group.